I'm optimistic because of the passion I see. Not even passion is the wrong word, it's curiosity. That's what I'm really picking up on, is that the more people look at nuclear and start to get familiar with it, they get just curious.
Just because the facts are A, if the narrative is B and everyone believes the narrative, then B is what matters. But it's our job in our industry to speak up proudly, soberly, and to engage people in this dialogue. Those 2.5 billion people that are in energy poverty, they need us.
America cannot meet this threat alone.
If there is a single country,
Of course, the world cannot meet it without America.
that is willing to
We're going to need you, the next generation, to finish the
overhaul
job.
nuclear regulation,
We need scientists to design new fuels.
focus on net public
We
benefit
need engineers to invent new technologies. We need
over absurd levels of radiation protection,
entrepreneurs to sell those technologies.
then we will march towards this.
We need workers to operate assembly lines that hum with high-tech, zero-carbon
We have
components.
unlimited prosperity for all humans.
We need diplomats and businessmen and women and Peace Corps volunteers to help developing nations skip past the dirty phase of development and transition to sustainable sources of energy. In other words, we need you.
Okay,
All right, here we go.
welcome to another episode of Fire Division podcast. We've got Tay Stevenson from Envoy Public Lands. So thanks for coming on. I really appreciate you spending the time, taking the time to chat with us. Want to dig into kind of the work that you guys are doing right now publicly and hear all about it. But before we do that, I want to chat about kind of your background and how you got into nuclear.
Yeah. So my background, I started really into campaign politics. My first job out of college was as a state senate candidate in Minnesota. I had gone back my senior winter of college and won my hometown Senate seats endorsement. So I was running a full general campaign right out of graduation. And that tripped into another campaign. We lost both of those pretty close, relatively. I think the last campaign in 2012, we lost by about 8 points. And then the next Democratic candidate who ran lost by 30 points in that district.
Okay.
A lot of that was just a really strong ground campaign. We did a lot of grassroots, a lot of door knocking. That market had a lot of just very young volunteers and a lot of community volunteers. We had little seniors for Stevenson Brigade who would come in during the day and call other seniors who were, of course, at home during the day, and they'd talk.
Yeah.
So that's where I got picked up and honed a lot of the grassroots techniques that you just get from grassroots organizing and campaign politics, and then stuck in my hometown for a few years trying to figure out what to do. And that's where I had some good opportunities. I didn't get paid very much, but I was working in the nonprofit space. And so had a lot of leadership resources thrown at me. And so I was able to go through a number of good programs, learn how to build a nonprofit, which I don't know how I've missed it. It's a lot harder to do than building a business.
Right. So
Like you literally have to do all of the things that you have to do to build a business, but you don't make any money. You don't have a product to sell. It's just we're gonna do good work and we're just gonna hope money comes to fill that mission. And of course, everything you have to do is on Facebook or any type
Right.
of social media, and you're building your brand, and there's just a lot of bleed for what you're trying to get done. And that's what tripped me into Generation Atomic.
Yeah.
So I grew up in Minnesota, and friend of a friend, a guy by the name of Eric Meyer, gave
very
me
well known in the nuclear
Yes,
industry.
very well
He's done a lot with that organization.
also a phenomenal singer.
Vocalist,
For
yeah.
the, if the
There's
word's
lots
not
of
on
evidence for
that, yeah, if the word's not out on that already, definitely check that out. But yeah, Eric was just frankly in a group of friends that was like in random orbit. And it was shocking how we didn't meet for 4 years. Like everyone just, when they were stories.
You guys were in the same area.
Same state, Minnesota's big state, but I think he was up in Duluth. And when I was Brainerd in Twin Cities, and there's like a 2-hour equilateral triangle between all of those things.
Yeah.
And so just the nights I was hanging out with that group of folks, for whatever reason, Eric wasn't there and vice versa, until kind of one fateful night, we got together, and I woke up the next morning on his couch. And as one does in their 20, when they're in their 20s and have a man bun, that'll happen. And that was when I was introduced to the concept of full service friendship. And that kind of sprouted a conversation on climate change and decarbonization. I'd always been a proponent of nuclear, and I stood out at the DFL party. Part of it is foreshadows everything. It's like I didn't get what the opposition was. It was just like it's clean carbon-free power. It wasn't even like the miss opposition. It's like kind of divorced like the Chernobyl aspect of just It is what it is. That's common.
These things might happen.
Again, when you're dealing with a system like you had in Soviet Russia, many things will happen like that. But here in America, like we prove it. Or the hallmark 3 Mile Island is just a situation where the safety system eventually worked and nobody got hurt, and it was a big commercial disaster, but it is what it is. That's
So you and Eric,
anyway, back to back.
Yeah.
Let's get back on track. So I basically tripped into nuclear on this whim of Eric is out doing stuff with environmental progress, and I was doing Michael Schellenberger's group, and then I'm doing ranked choice voting advocacy in the state and kind of building a model of how to do grassroots canvassing for like long form issues based around like critical issues. And we built it knowing that we could really, it's a giant issue, right? And that's where kind of the brainchild generation atomic comes into play. And we go to Ohio and do our best to help out folks to save Davis, Bessie, and Perry. And that got me sort of into and all recognized as a fairly small bubble of nuclear, right? Was able to talk about messaging, and that's where we got our first opportunities with EPL.
It was Generation Atomic, and how did it start? Why did it start? What was the goal, mission?
Yeah, so I think this is important because it's an inflection point in my thought is, again, Eric was the one who knew stuff about nuclear. Like I knew how to run a nonprofit, and I knew how to do grassroots organizing and how to message, right? And I just was a fan of the technology generally. And so the way I view it is with Gen A, we were really focused on the general public and trying to solve the general public's perception problems around nuclear as like the key to getting nuclear, saving current fleet, and then obviously trying to put some new reactors in the ground.
And just advocating.
And yeah, again, with the general public as like the sort of the tipping point, the fulcrum of where you needed to invest those resources. What I started to get a sense of fairly early on was that the industry itself was the interesting organizing challenge. As somebody who is, again, coming up with the grassroots mindset, it was odd to me that we were coming up with what was really sticky messaging. There's a story that I won't tell, but basically going in, we figured that we could get a 40% conversion rate outdoors. And what that means in industry parlance is that when we would make contact, knock on the door, and these were completely untargeted, it's just if you're going down the street, we'd get somebody to come to the door 40% of the time on our iPads. We figured we could get someone to sign their name and say, I support nuclear and here's why. We ended up getting 60% of people.
That's really good.
Right? It wasn't getting them. It was literally, again, we weren't about nuclear. We just said, here, you have 2 plants that are coming down. We had a little iPad with visuals and everything and said, it's 90% of your clean energy in the state, which is an environmental issue. Yeah, I can't remember the job figure anymore, but it was some thousands of jobs, right? All of your jobs in economics. And then we had a different, it was like 60% of the mentor school district areas was their tax base was that, and it was like something like 80% for Davis Bessie. That's big. So we had those numbers. So you had basically a choose your own adventure of, do you care about this because of the environment? Do you care about this because of the jobs, or do you care about this because of like the community and the tax base? And then we just followed where people were at. And that's, I think, when we figured out that we approach it from folks' value base and tying nuclear to how that fits in, people realize that, oh yeah, I'm actually pretty well in support. And everybody, it shouldn't come. One of my favorite nuclear facts is that if you look at one demographic, number one predictor for whether you are support nuclear power is your proximity to a plant. Right? It has nothing to do with any traditional, old, young, your right sex, anything like that. It is literally how close do you live to the plant? Yeah, it's more likely that you're going to support nuclear just because you're familiar with it. And so we had these messaging points, and for reasons in hindsight that really past understanding. I have no idea why early on anyone put us on the stage, anyone asked us to be on a panel, anyone asked us to get us. I have no idea why.
You guys are well spoken.
Sure, we'll go with that. But no, we did get those opportunities, and we said what we saw. I certainly did. And I had this notion that I'd always pictured it as like a cavalry coming over the hill. Here, take this message and go here. We can attack at this point. And I'd look, and there's no cavalry coming over the hill. And there's a mentor I had who's instrumental in kind of what we did with Generation Time. We've still literally talked to him 2 weeks ago on an issue that we're working on right now. But he was talking me through it, and I was saying, hey, why is the cavalry not coming over the hill? And he said, which is, we've talked about, I've literally told the story 5 times already today. We've been talking to legislators, but basically this idea that if you think of the industry, right, the nuclear industry, think of, you have a very clear mental picture. The gold miner with the hat, the real cars, the big coal, like
smokestack,
emissions. Yeah, you know what that industry
coal.
is. Like you might not like it, but you at least have an immediate mental picture. In one of those speeches, I said, "Here's the face of the nuclear industry." Put Homer Simpson's face up because that's kind of it. But really, and that kind of betrays, like most people think of the cooling towers, right? The utilities that are nuclear owner operators, and that's the industry. And this mentor of mine goes, right, but if you think about it, those utilities are the nuclear industry in roughly the same way that you as an owner operator of a Volkswagen GTI are a member of the automobile industry. Yeah, I'm not on the same team as VW when we're like lobbying the government for our interests. And that once you see that
dissociation.
Yeah, you start to see, and then you start to look at who's really advocating for policy at both the federal and the state and local level. It's folks who have a clean interest in particularly advanced reactor technology. There's supply chain, there's a robust industry, there's some really good people in it, but it's not massively capitalized. We're not talking about, other than you could maybe point out Westinghouse and GE, and those are in terms of just like hard money, but those are also not just nuclear companies. They have other business lines and other interests. And that's where I think the challenge ultimately stemming from for nuclear is that you don't have this coalesced lobby, right? You don't have oil and gas, you don't have coal, you don't have that clear mental picture. And
so it's an opportunity that Generation Atomic was helping to fill. And
I think Generation Atomic, that first year, while I was there, we were operating under the assumption, and it's ultimately been proven false, that the utilities had like a social notion, like there was like a social capital in keeping those plants open for carbon free. And now, granted, that's looking like a pretty good bet now, right? But we were like, this is 2016, so we were a little ahead of the curve on that. And that's where hopefully there is a little bit more of a sea change, is that folks do start to see, whether it's for the economic reasons or for the environmental reasons, or we'll call them A, we'll call them B, and other reasons on top of that, the workforce, that they start seeing that utilities start putting money behind saving these assets. So some of them are, and there have been some robust campaigns, but again, we've also seen some of them have just been shut down without much of a fight.
Yeah, it's bizarre. I had the same opinion that I think you guys had, which was, oh, of course, utilities want to keep nuclear power plants open because it's clean energy, it's green energy, and it's a good PR move for them. But with the economics and a lot of market dynamics, just like you said, with the car analogy, they own the car. They don't really care which car they use, trying to move people or bus or whatever to carry the metaphor through.
I think, I think that's, you're latching on that. If you think of it that way, utilities are really more of like, there are people movers in the transportation space. And if it's cars, if it's rail, if it's hyperloops,
they'll do the cheapest, best option for their business.
Right. Whatever keeps folks satisfied and keeps them moving from point A to point B. In that same way, I think, and not in any judgment, it's a really hard job, and they're doing a phenomenal job doing it. You got to keep the lights on. If you understand the physics of the grid, which no one does, like that is an amazing feat, and give the utility their due, but also hold them accountable for, no pun really intended here, the power that they have and the importance they have in the communities. All by way of saying, and this is what, if you switch over to where EPL is really focused a lot of its work now, as we're a private company, we're consultants.
So EPL, that's your current organization, Envoy Public Labs. So you were with Generation Atomic for about a year?
About a year.
Help getting off the ground. I mean, they've since blossomed into like this advocacy, great organization, lots of volunteers, nonprofit.
And that's credit to Eric and the crew, carrying on sort of the heart of Gen A, which was trying to train advocates to better talk about nuclear. And I think I think
they do a great job.
I'm a little biased, but I think they're some of the best at it. Again, part of it is that there's a humanity
Yeah.
behind like
There's
this.
actual faces and people.
It's that, and that's what's important. It's about the relationships, and that's if you want to look at the line to EPL, we have a very different approach to organizing. We do advocacy, particularly when we're talking about our federal work. But
Yeah. So what happened when you were with the group and then you decided that there might be a different opportunity and
Yep.
give you a chance to go on and watch something else?
And that was a really tough decision. That was a hard look.
So how'd you make it? What were the factors that went into it?
So it was pretty clear to me, again, I couldn't get away from the fact that I wanted to organize the industry. I wanted to be a part of doing something, and I didn't know what that meant. And I still don't think I could give you a working definition of that other than it feels like we're starting to align more as interests and act in concert, right? There's more a sense of we're all in this together. And that's been building for about 2 years now, it feels.
I agree. As somebody who came from the outside, I agree with that.
And I'm in no way claiming that me and Chase did that. I think that there's a whole group of people. I always call them the Emperor has no clothes club, right? Folks who just truly see it, that the Emperor has no clothes, right? The utilities aren't the industry, right? There is an important nuclear advocacy component, and those are shoes to fill, right? Yeah. And there's a whole bunch of people. I'm not going to just name drop here.
Yeah.
It's all people that, like, frankly, I owe all of these opportunities to. They're the ones who I think have helped guide that establishment of a newer culture within. And I think that's really important. And we're starting to set metrics for what we're aiming for. And I think
so. Envoy Public Labs. What's your guys' mission statement or goals? Or
that's a great story. So we're sitting there in Texas. And it's myself, Sam Bruin, and the other original founder, John Landis. And we all have made a decision. We're leaving Gen, and we're going to go start our own thing. Eric, we were going to strip it down. Eric was going to take it and go in a different direction. And so we made that creative decision to break up the band, right?
Sure.
And Sam, John, and I all do our own thing. And my thing was to try to figure out what EPL was. So I focused mostly on what I thought were the important guys. I literally, the most pretentious way possible, sat on the beach in South Australia and wrote down.
It's a great place to brainstorm.
Yeah, a journalist spent all like 6 days journaling, but had an epiphany that never didn't commit to the journaling exercise from then on. But no, I kind of looked at it very bluntly, like I needed to get healthy. Like I was probably 50 pounds heavier than I am now. So that's a lot of extra.
Big guy.
I am big. I needed to be
You're
less bigger guy. And a lot of it, like Jen, there was like 14 months where I didn't buy a round trip flight. I was just like one-way ticket to one-way ticket, no idea where I was going. And so a lot of what I initially focused on was like, okay, but I've been feeling strong and like making good decisions in the last 4 or 5 years. What have I been doing? And then from there, I looked at, okay, what are the interesting things, right? I have a degree in philosophy, right? I'm like, what are the kind of the first principles that I think are really interesting that I would start diving in on? And that's where there's just the serendipity of you just can't make this shit up. Spent my last airline miles. I had a buddy who was going to be going to France and said, hey, if you water my plants, you can crash my apartment. So I had a place in DC that I would have had to spend $2,000 I didn't have. And that was when I didn't have the money for an airline ticket, but
hilarious that was what he wanted you to do, was water his plants.
Yeah,
I know who you're talking about.
It is what it is.
Name, but
you got to be. I mean, it's super helpful. But
yeah.
Point being, like, I just emailed everyone I knew, and there were a bunch of people who emailed back. And
so you had a thesis for an organization. You had a chance to go to DC.
What I had was a question, which was, and these are folks who, again, had been watching what we were doing in Gen A and saw what we were doing was a little bit different. And 2 names I will definitely name drop is one was Jeff Harper, right? And Jeff's, incredibly smart guy. And, just has always been a friend in terms of, helping kind of guide me along. And we sat there. I mean, we got dinner, and it was one of those things where the dinner lasted for 5 hours. This is a Harvard Business School graduate who's throwing out every idea he could think of. And the idea that I caught that night that I knew was going to stick was you should do like government funded market research, and you could probably help the industry by really dialing in these states and helping us figure out what the domestic market is, which again, Now it sounds like a really good idea. It's like, yeah, someone should definitely start that business, but this is 2018.
You're like government funded. Where
Yeah.
are the dollars?
Yeah, there was not a ton of interest in
There's no
state level.
bipartisan infrastructure law. There's no Inflation Reduction Act.
So the other person I stumbled into, again, a story for a different time, the most bizarre nuclear event I ever have and ever will go to, but Rita Barrymore at the time was director, and I told her about this conversation I'd had with Jeff, and she just said, give it to me. And okay, this is about 2-3 months later. And the reason why is, and this is a story we tell everybody that asks us about GAIN, is that was the moment GAIN had established the voucher program, and that was doing a really good job and had like really good industry buy-in.
And I suspect a lot of people watching this are listening know what GAIN is, but that's the
Gateway for Accelerated Innovation Nuclear.
Yeah.
And so that's a DOE initiative that's housed at INL. The important piece is it's housed at INL, but it reaches out to all the national labs. And so
Yeah.
you're really bringing the best competencies of all those labs into kind of a one-stop shop. And so our program, which still continues, in my opinion, get biased, thriving and really helping out, filling these gaps and moving commercialization for advanced reactors along. We just started to get the very blunt sense that all of these technical breakthroughs might not that they won't matter, but there's another part on the critical path, which was the communities who had to adopt the technology itself. Yes, the customer, but the customer is part of a community that needs to make this decision.
Yeah, these are large, heavily regulated industrial facilities that the community has to bring in.
Yes.
And if no one's educating the community, that all the technology developers just kind of, if you build it, they will come. But that's not always true.
Why it's hardly ever true.
It's hardly ever true.
That's why I really call Field of Dreams about that.
Yeah.
Which is a great movie. Great movie. I love Kevin Costner, but I definitely watched that movie, with my dad several times. But point being, it's not maybe the best way to, it's maybe not the best general bet for an industry. I don't think that's too far.
So if I'm going public labs, you had an idea that, or I guess you're meeting with Rita and.
So the idea was we might need to be doing a similar type of thing for communities. Because even before that, if you build it, they will come, there's this notion of the first step in a project is always, you have to conceive of it. And once you conceive of it, start to plan for it. And to jump ahead, we started doing this sort of pilot inquiry based off of commentary that GAIN got at a forum, basically saying, hey, there's a panel of folks who were thought of as first movers and literally said, we have no idea how to plan for this. We're on an island. We're completely alone. And that's a direct quote from one of those participants. We're on an island. We're completely alone. We have no idea how to plan for this. So we're just muddling ahead. Sure enough, again, truly jumping ahead. We're in Minnesota, starting to talk to some of the utilities, and we're asking them, how are you planning for advanced reactor? And they're like, what?
What do you mean?
What's an advanced reactor? We ask them can you name, like a vendor of like an SMR vendor? And they're like, I'd say maybe about, it picked up towards, the last, after about a year, but a lot of new core, new star.
Yeah, people are ignorant about the industry and who the key players.
It was there was basically no awareness of, you go into USNIC or an NEI or any of these conferences and you think, again, this is 2018, you think that this is an industry that is ready to burst. So there we go. And then we're sitting out and we start talking to folks. In the conference, these people are prime customers. They are a key market number. They're ready to go and ready to buy this technology. The numbers work. They had done the deal, and we're talking to these customers. They've never heard of any of these vendors, any of this technology. They had a molten salt Uzi, a fast reactor. What are you talking
So
about?
there's a big education gap.
Huge information gap.
Huge from the perceived from the vendors or what they're projecting.
Right.
And then what the communities and the stakeholders that will actually be building and have the technology systems in their communities.
And then you're right on it, Mark. It wasn't just that folks didn't know. It was that no one knew that no one was actually filling this. It was this assumption that either it's getting out ether, right? This is all just transferring via osmosis, or someone else is who's on first. Someone else was doing that.
Oh, surely there's a group out there.
Oh yeah, those people, someone was definitely talking to those people. And it was really game that stood up and said, no, they're not. And someone needs to. And why not us? Because it's the national labs. And what's needed right now, frankly, again, my blunt opinion, isn't a ton of advocacy. I think there's some lobbying work that could be done that I think industry should pick up, which again, we're circling back on the early part of the conversation. But right now, folks, we've traversed the bridge. The word has gotten out on advanced strategy. Folks know what they are now. They can name developers. They know that Bill Gates is doing a thing in Wyoming. It's getting into the cultural milieu, but they're starting to ask second order questions. Number one, and this makes me really excited, is what can we do with this? Is hydrogen a thing we can do with nuclear? Is decarbonizing industry, is chemicals a thing we can do with nuclear? And I say it very intentionally that way, because it's very early on. There's very limited vocabulary. They're not sitting here saying, how do we integrate molten cell technology with solar utilizing thermal storage? They're not, and that's even, again, this is philosophy guy just run with engineers.
Yeah.
They're not to where the industry speaks in terms of conversation for possibilities.
And help characterize they.
It's a great question. They are about 15 people in each state. There's two things that we heard when we were following up. So we pilot in Minnesota, we're tracking through time. We go to Arizona to basically prove.
So literally 15 human beings that could be key decision makers.
And that's a little tongue in cheek, but
aggressive estimate. But
it's also, you hear this phrase thrown around all the time, or in organizing circles, is STP, same 10 people. You go into any community, right?
Same 10 people.
The same 10 people are the ones who are putting on the charity gala, the ones who organized the new walkway at the park. It's the same 10 people who are somewhat in great communities. Those are dynamic people who are bringing in broader ideas, and bringing in those 10 people are leveraging 1,000 people. And
the community that you're focused on is a state level. Can we get
state principle applied?
State legislators
Right.
and governor on board, and people that really can advocate.
To where I was going with this, Arizona is where we hear two different stories where it's like they both say essentially the same thing. We have one guy, just the old man of Arizona energy politics, and just knew the history back from before Arizona was a state, basically. He just goes, there's 2,000 lawyers in Arizona, and I talked to 20 of them. And then another meeting, different guy who'd been basically involved in any energy deal that had happened in Arizona since I was in the late 80s. He basically said, look, you want to put a new nuke in Arizona, there's going to have to be about 15 people whose heads are nodding their on a table. And that table isn't a real table, but they're there.
But they
all need to be nodding their head, or at least not shaking their head no. And that's what really, and again, that's what sort of coalesces that this isn't a nuclear problem. This is just an organizing problem. And nuclear just happens to be the thing we got to organize around. And it's finding those 15 people, and they're not obvious. There's one guy in Washington State, when we were looking at this for game, there were two people that we focused on as key folks. And one of them was basically just an external affairs guy, and another guy was an analyst at an NGO that I could have given you a dart to throw at the masthead on that thing. He wasn't the CEO. Right. It wasn't the executive VP of analytics. It was just the guy who was in every room and was smart, and people were listening and had the relationships.
Interesting.
And once we started to see.
So it's not obvious who the key decision maker might be or influencing.
Some of them are. Typically speaking, the energy chair in the House and or the Senate in each state is going to have at least a vote on energy projects that are going on. There's folks in regulatory. There's standard, just the way that state's structured, but even that, another classic line that I've repeated many times: if energy policy in one state, energy policy in one state, right? If you're going to pass a renewable portfolio standard in Minnesota, the first state we looked at this in, that's a legislative issue that, frankly, Minnesota's looking at right now. In Arizona, there's a policy docket that the Arizona Corporation Commission, or the ACC, right? Not the one on the Atlantic coast, but they're to a person known as the fourth branch of government in Arizona. They handle all energy policy decision making, totally different ways to do government, but at the same time, they still are going to they're making a decision about nuclear, whether it's folks who are lobbying or advocating in the legislature of Minnesota or commenting on the policymaking document in Arizona. It's still the same 10 people, and it's nuclear, it's batteries, it's biomass, it's everything.
Okay, so you figured out this hole in the system that could be filled through, I'll say, back research
Sure.
that Public Lands
Labs, yeah.
has worked to fill. So now you're moving throughout the country and speaking to key stakeholders and finding the right people in each state to,
Yep.
I'll say, educate and
Sure.
inform about new nuclear opportunities.
Yeah.
And then be a resource for them.
I think that's
So like sum that.
yeah,
down?
that's summed up really well.
Yeah.
I mean, what we're doing, and I would even say we're only partially filling. That's where, again, we can't do GAIN or any federal part can't do this on their own. And I think what we heard, particularly today, it's been pretty clear for the last several years, is that
For people.
we're in Denver.
Yeah, we're in Denver, we're in Colorado.
So yeah, I'm in the middle of a 4-week just state to state road trip
Yeah,
here.
talked about Arizona.
Yeah, Arizona, yeah.
We're in Denver now, so.
Pennsylvania and Virginia and headed
God
to-
bless
headed
my
to
home state of
Texas.
Colorado.
Yes, and it is a great state.
Very cold, right? Yeah.
We brought that with us from Minnesota. It's, yeah.
I don't know if it'll be cold when we release this podcast, but it's freezing right now, so.
Hopefully we can only hope it's not. But no, we were talking to some state legislators today and just generally telling them what GAIN does. I always joke, like I try to make a point at every meeting now that I just say we're from the government, we're here to help, because there is this, and it's in a lot of ways well learned, not just with nuclear, this notion of federal government overreach. And what GAIN has done a really good job in is, I think, setting a model for how nuclear, not just with the government, but like I think that, GAIN has kind of tipped how folks look at advocating is, there's an honesty to it, like a true transparency to it, which I think is obviously a good thing. But there's a humility to it, right? Where you look at where GAIN is working and operating, it's where the communities or the states, or in a lot of cases both, are working ahead and they know where they're going. Right? They know what their values are and they know what the problem is. And it's multivariable calculus. It's a hard energy, economic, community transition in a lot of these communities, a lot of particularly coal communities. And
Meaning at the state level, they're trying to develop a plan to transition.
transition, yeah.
Still address all the
And so
needs.
this is all swirling. These are all conversations that are happening, again, from the governor's office down to the county commissioner, down to the city council and the local chamber. And boy, is it useful to have a nuclear phone a friend where like you can, there's no politics involved. There's no D's or R's. There's PhDs. I'm not going to say that is literally the first time I've ever said that. So we'll see if that one sticks. But like that, there really is just this notion of good, helpful people. People who are good at math, who are willing to help you with this math problem.
Yeah.
And Christine King, the director again, I think has done a really good job.
Fabulous individual.
It's truly, again, great leader, somebody who I'll say this, like the big thing that's, I think, other than losing some weight and things, the thing that Christine and a few others, but Christine in particular has shown me is like, I can totally be myself and still be a good leader. I can be flawed, right? I can not always have the right words or say the right thing and still get a message across that if it's honest and it's open, where people can participate and folks are willing to just kind of accept who you are. And I think that's, again, we come at this work from the ground up with that mentality, right? Is that, we are here to help, but we have an idea of what that role is. And that role is kind of in the hip pocket, right? Where you're going ahead and we're kind of helping, shape the conversation of possibilities. Because a lot of times if you don't know, you don't know. And so like a question of, have you thought of this? Maybe can help open up. And if this isn't the right way, we can do the math on it. And so to the point, Christine has done a great job of being very clear that, yeah, sure. If like if we help do the math on the economics and the jobs and everything and the decarbonization goals, and it all boils out that sure, nuclear makes a ton of sense here. Great, then GAIN's done its job. But if that math pencils out and nuclear isn't the math, then great, GAIN's done its job.
Yeah.
Like we've helped the community, we've helped the state make a smart decision, particularly around advanced reactors, which aren't exactly the easiest topic. I've spent 5 years on them. I'm a pretty smart dude, and I still don't fully have my arms wrapped around the concept. Like it's gonna take a lot of people with a lot of difference. I always say it's not how smart you are, it's how you're smart. And there's going to have to be a lot of different how you're smarts, looking at this problem from a lot of different angles and being willing to trust and communicate with each other to execute this type of transition.
Gotcha. That's awesome. Can we use Colorado or maybe another state as an archetype or example to talk about a few specifics?
I think Colorado's
what you guys are trying to accomplish.
I think Colorado's a great example, and it's becoming a great example. And I don't want
It's relevant. You're here.
Yeah, I don't want to betray confidence or talk out of school here, but in very broad brushstrokes, what I'm seeing happening in Colorado, which is similar to what we've seen in the last year and a half in Kentucky and in Montana. The quick clip notes on Montana is I think it's a pretty cool moment when a community, like literally the community of Colstrip, says, hey, we're looking at how we're going to deal with this coal plant and what our future is over the next 20 years. And they say
Colstrip is that a town?
It's literally a town.
That's called Colstrip.
It's called Colstrip. It doesn't have an A, but you wouldn't anticipate.
And I assume there's coal there and coal plant.
There's coal there and a coal plant, and there's a golf course, and there is a community center, and there is about 2,000 people there who are very proud of their town. And I get that. Like, I'm from Brainerd, Minnesota. I'm very proud of my town, and they're proud of their town and what they've built there. But they know they have really difficult challenges, but they're making it work.
Meaning the world wants to close their plants, and
they
say that,
that's going to be a big problem for folks who've established a way of life in that area. And for the national labs to have a role where they're literally asked to come out and be in an auditorium, and for 150 people to come out in an auditorium and sit there and take notes and have questions and listen. That's really cool.
Because it affects their future and their livelihood.
And again,
they're interested in the opportunity for nuclear to come into their community, and
they're skeptical. They're looking at it, right? They're looking at it. But again, it just the opportunity to be able to just honestly exchange. Here's the best math that we can do right now. Jason Hansen, who was the lead economist on the coal and nuclear report that gave for DOE, he was there. Like, literally walks out and talks about growing up in it was, I think, Wyoming, Montana. No. Yeah, I was one of the two. Sorry, Jason, for forgetting, but grew up in an area very similar to this and started with that. I said I became an economist because basically my grandpa said if you can do math, right, you're going to be able to help people make decisions. To be able to say that in that community, having been invited in, really cool. And that's what I think is building here in Colorado. Like, you look at what we've done in Northwest Colorado. Craig was, like those communities around Craig.
So people not familiar with Colorado, there's 2 coal plants that are
in Northwest
generating stations. Craig is the town where one's located, and Hayden's the town where the other one's located, and they're scheduled to be closed in 2027 to 2030, right?
Yeah, which again, not to focus on those communities specifically, that's a timeline that's facing a lot of people. Right, not just around the country, other people here in Colorado too.
Yeah, and anything that those coal plants are connected to.
Exactly.
People don't realize that power needs to be replaced from somewhere.
And to that point, that's where we're only talking about Craig and Hayden because those communities asking to come out and talk about nuclear advanced reactors and just start scratching the surface. Again, I love the metaphor of skipping the stone across the top of the water, just seeing where the ripples are at. And so we were able to come out at the end of the summer. And then we came out again and spoke with the Colorado Energy Office and some of the Senate leadership. And again, just having a conversation. What is nuclear? What are these advanced reactors? And what are the initial looks at how they might be applied in the economy? And that's where we're at. Like, it's literally step one. And if there are other coal communities that are out there, or frankly, just communities that think that this technology might be a fit for whatever reason. Maybe they've got a chemical plant, or maybe they want to have a chemical plant, right? That they want it to be, because chemicals are useful for things, right? And there's good paying jobs at those. Maybe they want to diversify their economy. That's something that they're interested in, figuring out where's the energy need there. That's where I think, again, GAIN has developed itself as a trusted partner to communities and the states in facilitating connections to subject matter experts who can help with that dialogue, right? So it's the communities themselves deciding where we want to go. GAIN is supporting, and that's where we've started to work with Pacific Northwest National Lab and the waste program, because anytime you get into a nuclear conversation, it inherently is a nuclear waste conversation. And so being able to then draw on that technical expertise out of waste, not to talk about policy, not to say, okay, where do we need to reopen Yucca Mountain, or do we need to do this, that, or the other thing? It's let's Let's pin that for a second. Let's start with nuclear waste is not green glowing goo, a 55-gallon drum. Let's
Explore pictures of
let's
chemicals.
just start there. Let's start there for the next, I don't know, say 3-4 months. And once we've got everybody in the country on board with that, then we can start talking about some other more complicated topics on waste. But that's, I think, again, starting that dialogue, and we're seeing more and more states and communities who want to start that dialogue, but they don't necessarily have that inherent vocabulary. And that's what the need is. It's not an advocacy problem. It's an information problem. And you need to have sort of a trustful relationship to start sharing those resources.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So your guys' time here in Colorado, you're here in Denver today. Yeah. Can you share your agenda or kind of what your schedule is and who you're trying to engage with?
I think we shouldn't.
That's fine.
It will
Yeah.
be, and that's one of the things is we definitely.
You talk about, let's ask the question a different way. The same 10 people,
Right.
maybe not in Colorado, but archetypes of who they might be and how they're valuable.
That I can definitely
Yeah.
hit. So all we can take it from that angle is what we're working with are, broadly speaking, you have environmental interests, you have local economic development, you have folks in policy, right? So whether that's county commissioners, state legislators, folks in the executive branch, regulatory, those are the types of, that's, I would say, generally speaking, your background of stakeholders that we're trying to reach out and chat with. And in particular, like what we're looking for are the folks who are championing. They want to have the nuclear conversation.
Yeah.
And that's where if we can act on good technical resources, that conversation can move at the speed of trust that they can generate. And that's
Speed of trust. I like the phrase.
yeah, it's a good one though. That it's out there, and folks I think are picking up on that. That this is only gonna. I can hand you a nuclear book. It's not going to matter unless you actually have that trust build up to have that conversation. So that's where you can see. And I'm not picking these out of a hat. Like these are the folks who, if there's a nuclear docket in the regulatory space, these are the folks who are commenting on the regulatory docket. If there's policy in the state house, they're the ones who are going up and they're testifying, or they're knocking on doors and talking to the state reps and the state senators. They're the ones who are planning the projects in the local communities, whether it's nuclear, which it's not, it's usually like a solar project or a car fair, right? Like they're the ones who are organizing these conversations. And that's interesting to us, right? Because if we can if we can participate, and emphasize the word participate, but that's not just a passive thing. We're not there sort of dumping, as officials from the government, reading a statement saying, here is your.
Let us preach at you.
Yeah, let us enlighten you with the word of nuclear and leave you with this gift basket. It's you're rolling up your sleeves and you're sitting down at the coffee. You're going to the diner. I literally, when we were in Colstrip, we were trying to figure out a venue for GAIN. We were literally trying to find a venue to do like this second day meet and greet thing. And I just said to the guy, we will set up tables in a parking lot if we have to.
Yeah, doesn't matter.
I don't care.
Yeah.
If we need to bring the donuts from Bozeman, we will do that.
We will do that.
Because the baker's off that day. It is what it is. But and I think again, that speaks to the mentality that we're coming with is we're not standing on pretense and we're here to do work. Like we're here to help out. You tell us, it's Jerry McGuire, help us help you. You're the lead. But we're there on your hip the entire way through.
Yeah. No, I think it's awesome. I think the mission of the group and the way that you put it together and the work that you're doing is super, super valuable. You said if communities decide to build a nuclear, replace coal with nuclear, then GAIN's done their job. And if not, then they've also done their job too. But curious on Tay's perspectives, maybe not anyone else's,
Sure.
But yeah, are we going to transition some coal plants to nuclear plants?
I sure hope so. Again, I'd like to see a lot of folks in Colstrip. I very seriously, I tell people my mom, I graduated from Brainerd High School in 2006. My mom graduated from Brainerd High School in 1978. She grew up on Mill Avenue and my grandpa worked at the mill. That mill closed in 1995.
Yeah.
I
saw the community transform, I'm sure.
Oh yeah, it's always been a little bit of a resort town, but now it is a resort town. There's not a paper mill there. There's not the state hospital. There's not the rail yard. The rail yard is going to be full for us.
I empathize. The place I'm from was a small oil field town, northwest Colorado, and the oil field started in the 30s, and there was a lot of industry there in the 80s, and you could tell a lot of capital investment then, but we're about the same age, and I watched it deteriorate as I grew up. And so seeing especially rural communities fall off like that, it can be really impactful.
And again, like, it's no joke. These communities, we were talking to a guy, again, I'm not going to call him out or anything, but he was saying, he was talking about how the community invested in a sidewalk project in a government center. And they had taken some novel approaches on getting those projects done. They really pulled the community together, and they had to overcome some adversity. And again, those in and of themselves, like, those are functional, practical things that are happening in lots of communities every day. But just the pride of this is something that we're doing. That is something that I don't think folks totally realize when they're talking about transition. Like, a lot of the time we're talking about this in rural communities. And we talk about transition, right? The underlying promise there is that we stuck these things out there in the middle of nowhere and asked people to live out there and run them. So that these things being pulled by any large fossil generating unit, right? And now there is a large policy decision being made, driven largely by urban population centers. You look at it, that's Colorado, that's Washington State, that's Minnesota, with the Twin Cities and the outstate. The dynamics at play. I'm not the first person to point out the rural urban divide in politics, but it's having an impact on the energy. And it's a social thing. It's a cultural issue, because climate change very much in the 5 years that we've been doing this has hit that tipping point of it is now a cultural issue. This isn't just a bunch of environmentalists and people who, like vegan food and can do math saying the world's going to end. Like, it's something that people deeply care about for a lot of different reasons that cross political boundaries and in a lot of ways are deeply personal. And so when you have that dynamic at play and look at where we're at right now, what is these rural communities kind of feeling like they're underrepresented and they have to have a voice, and they should have a voice in how they're going to make what's ultimately a generational and maybe even multi-generational investment in turn. It's a big boat that they're trying to turn. So I think it's an appropriate use of federal government resources to support that where appropriate.
Sure.
On the private side of things, and we've had an opportunity to work a little bit with some private companies, again, and it's a lot of the same model, but we have less strictures because of what we're playing. And that's where I think what I'll say about that just generally is just those brief opportunities, which we've really appreciated. And I think we've been able to do some really good work in some of the communities that we've worked in and built relationships in. I think it just speaks to the need for more of that from the nuclear industry. And again, I think we have a different definition of that at this point in the conversation. What do I actually mean by that? I think the utilities are going to have to, I think a lot of folks are looking at the utilities to pick that up, whether they will or won't, and at what time. We're kind of trying to bridge the gap, but that's where I think private industry and a lot of these companies who are trying to deploy this technology have an opportunity right now. The communities, it's hard to hear them because they don't necessarily know how to answer the question. It's not because they're dumb. It's because no one's ever sat down and talked to them about it. They don't know the words. It's like someone who's at a Super Bowl party and has never been told anything about football, and they're not talking because they don't know. All they know is like how to say, how about the Cowboys? It's just
like that analogy.
It's like that's a lot of what we see in waste. And I think that's where we'll ask, what about the waste? Because they have no idea how to even have this conversation. So that to me is where we have to listen a little bit more intently and listen almost for the silence and say, okay, I can tell you.
What are they not asking?
Yeah, what are they not?
And
it might be just as simple as reaching out and saying, hey, would this be useful? And which is, again, to bring it back, kind of the underlying, it's what we built with GAIN, it's what we're building with waste, is just this notion of it's okay to reach out and offer help.
Yeah.
So
that's great. So you want to build more plants. I want to build more plants. You guys are educating key stakeholders all throughout the country, advocating it, being the phone friend, nuclear guys. Leave us on an optimistic note. Do you feel like the sentiment's changing? People are excited about these prospects. They're enjoying getting educated. And where do you see this going?
I'm optimistic because of the passion I see. Not even passion is the wrong word. It's curiosity. That's what I'm really picking up on, is that the more people look at nuclear and start to get familiar with it, they get just curious. I've told the story before, but I was on the ground and just without any particulars that were on the ground, we're in a situation where we had this parent with a kid, and the kid's probably about 9 years old, and they're like we were on nuclear waste, and we had a little chunk of a mock-up of trisol fuel. It was like a piece of graphite. Yeah. And I'm standing next to this brilliant engineer, and he goes, "Do you want to hold the nuclear fuel?" And he immediately just goes, I don't know if I want to do that. And the parent sees the teaching moment, right? Says, "Oh, no, it's okay. You can hold it." And so he drops this little chunk of cross section hexagon of graphite with like those little pockmarks that represent trisol. But point being, to just describe the look on her face, I'm holding nuclear stuff. Like I'm holding nuclear.
Yeah.
And that's a start.
That's transformative.
Right. And then all of a sudden the questions just start to pop out. Right. It's what can we do with this? How hot does it get? What do you do with the heat? Can we do this? Can we do that? On there, when you start to have those conversations for possibilities, and then people start to pick up again some of the lingo, the vocabulary, and you start to get into the difference between high temperature reactors, right? And maybe that's an interest because you're looking at figuring out how you hard to decarbonize industrial sectors, and you're starting to look at 900 to 1,000 degree outlet temperatures, right? Now that starts to make sense. Or maybe you are really concerned about the fuel cycle, and so you start to develop an interest in fast reactors. Now all of a sudden, the things about plutonium you think you never knew, right? That's where I think we need to continue to push the conversation. So wherever you're at, right? If you're in the federal government, you clearly have an important role to do, right? Maybe the most important role. Because particularly if you have any type of social sense, you're a trusted person. You can go out and have these conversations with some level of authority, in which that bears a lot of responsibility. You have to be careful with that, but it's not something you should be fearful. It's something that is a privilege that folks are asking for your input. Now, if you're an advocate, right? If you can go out and you can be an advocate for the technology, that's where you can start taking on the policy battles, right? In ways that the federal government or any government entity, and a lot of nonprofits, academic institutions, a lot of them want to stay back from that water edge. They rely on, I very much probably would include myself in this camp, I'm relying on people who are advocates to carry forward the message, to basically say to the policymakers, okay, so now you heard all of that. What does that make you think? Let's run this to ground. Let's figure out a way that this makes sense for our community, our state, right? And that's where I'm not going to get into the whole lobbyists, particularly at the state level, when you have the limited resources. A lot of times, lobbyists that are working at the state level typically are people who are working on it because they're passionate. They're not getting paid. They're not hurting at all. I'm not going to cry poverty for any friends who are in the lobbying profession or people out there. But at the same time, like a lot of times, they're the key resource. They're one of the 16 people typically, because they have the relationships and they have the knowledge base. And typically, they're not advocating for one client. They've got 16 clients. So they have so many conflicts of interest or non-conflicts of interest that they almost have to just be in a neutral mode anyway. Because I say that a little bit tongue in cheek, but what I do say seriously, the folks who are lobbying at the state level, they live in those states. And so they have an interest in seeing good policy making. And so everyone's got a role to play. And I think the information piece is a lion's share. The lobbying piece is pretty small, but I think is important. It has to be handled by the right people, and I think it should be led by what is now, I think, a coalescing industry. And for folks who I would imagine are the audience for this podcast, who maybe would put themselves more in an advocate role, you're the important bridge, right? That's the key. And my advice on all of that is stay humble and stay on just the facts. Because the second you lose trust with someone, the second people think that you're advocating for something that's about you and not about them, that's when they not only tune you out, they tune out everything you're saying. And fortunately for nuclear, what I find is we've got a lot of really good people who they are very compassionate and empathetic, and we have the facts on our side. So if you're looking for your optimistic note, when you have those two ingredients and they're pointed at the right thing, I think a lot of really good things can happen.
Couldn't end it on a better spot than that. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.